can I be an infantry airborne ranger? And at first they kind of tried to talk me out of it. Okay, do you know what you're asking for? I just said, hey, look, you, Mr. President, I appreciate you being here. You don't know me, but I've been fighting these wars for 20 years. You're getting it right, but you're being undermined at the mid to senior levels in ways that I've never seen before.
Really, to me, you're once in a generation type of candidate who you've seen combat, you know what that's like, you've lost loved ones, you've lost friends. This country needs people like you in Congress. Joe Kent, welcome to Battleground, man. It has been far too long. I watched your candidacy last cycle. I paid close attention to it, man. I love what you stand for, and 20 years in the Special Forces, and then some more time as a CIA guy. It seems like you've been serving your country your entire life, man.
Yeah, I never thought of it as a job. I thought of it as a calling, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the people I was around, and just like you, I'm sure I considered my jump into the political realm unexpected, but also a continuation of service.
Yeah, man, mine was real unexpected. I got this service dog charity that I just threw myself into after I got out, and I've been doing that for a decade, and writing books and writing fiction books. Politics was always something that I was interested in, that I paid attention to, and I helped good candidates, I thought, and was involved at the local, state, federal level. And then Trump came along and just called me out randomly in Western Pennsylvania, and I was like, I wasn't even there, never met him, never talked to him. Oh, wow. But the guy, so that's how I got into this craziness as like a complete outsider. But you're an outsider too, and yeah. I think with that, I mean, this is what I loved about you and your candidacy, is that you bring a perspective that many in Washington don't have, Joe. And if you look at the state of this country with, what's happening on our southern border, tidal wave of human suffering. We just learned that the FBI was colluding with Twitter, spying on the American people, censoring the American people, with our own tax dollars. It seems like there's a war against law enforcement in this country. Our debt and deficit are soaring. I've never seen anything like it before in our country. It just seems like everything's going off the rails. What the hell do you make of all of this?
Man, it's just so broad, and it seems like every day we learn more and more about how our government not just lies to us, but in many cases, most cases it seems, they're conspiring against the American people. They're making a mockery of everything that you and I fought for. And so that's why I got into this, because I got just so absolutely frustrated. And since the Biden regime really took over, we have just seen this deliberate plan, because I don't think it's incompetence. Biden does a very good job of being a goofy, senile old man / corrupt politician. And so it's easy to say on first pass, like, oh, this guy's just incompetent. However, if you just look at we're 2 years into this thing now. If you just look at what they've done, you mentioned the southern border, what they've done to the economy, what they've done in the energy sector. I don't have to tell you, you're in Pennsylvania. I mean, the way that's just hurting people every single day, stealing a month of their wages. We are in the managed decline of our nation. And so I feel like this is, from my Green Beret perspective, this is unconventional warfare being waged against the American people, the American sovereign nation state.
Joe, you saw, and speaking of your Green Beret experience, 20 years, retired, right? Retired Special Forces guy. Yep. What was the catalyst for you to join the military in the first place?
Man, that's a really good question. I think as long as little kids can tell their parents what they want to be when they grow up, my answer was like G.I. Joe, Commando, something. I think, G.I. Joe cartoons and the A-Team definitely played a factor, but it's always what I wanted to do, which, I grew up just across the river from where I am now in Portland, Oregon, which most people would be like, oh my God, you grew up in Portland, Oregon. So maybe some of it was like the easiest way to rebel in Portland, Oregon was to enlist in the military. So maybe there's some of that, but I always wanted to join the military. For me, 1993, the Black Hawk Down incident, the Battle of Mogadishu, that was sort of like a mini 9/11 for me, because I think cable network news had just gotten real big, and so that was the first real brutal combat that I think was really just piped into everyone's living rooms. And I saw that, and I was 13 years old at the time, and I was really interested in the military. I was reading everything about mostly Vietnam stories of Green Berets and SEALs and Rangers and all that, and so I kind of knew who was who. And I was like, man, these are really young guys. These guys are probably 4 or 5 years older than me that are out there engaged in this just absolutely savage combat, horrific scenes of Americans getting their bodies dragged through the street. And I said, like, who are those guys? Can I go join them as soon as I graduated? And so I talked to the recruiters, and they said, well, boy, if we got a deal for you, you can go right to Ranger Battalion if you just sign your name right here. And so
wait, what did they tell you? What did the recruiters tell you?
I mean, at first they were just like, I mean, they were really excited that someone, I mean, because it's not an easy
someone in
deal.
Portland.
Yeah. So they're used to having, I think, to roll out the whole like, hey, here's all the free college and you can go learn a language and all this other stuff. And I was like, hey, can I be an infantry airborne ranger? And, they were like, get this kid a contract right now. So at first they kind of tried to talk me out of it because I think some of my recruiter is actually a really good guy. He was like a hospital service guy, and he was like, hey, do you know what you're asking for? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, okay, all right, here you go, man. Before you change your mind, let's get you to sign this thing.
They probably have a quota of 1 out in Portland. He probably hit his quota with you.
Yeah. He probably got promoted off the whole thing, Yeah.
Well, so okay, so you sign up. You said you want to go into the infantry. You want to go to airborne school. You want to go to ranger school. Do you hit all those schools? Did you go to basic at Fort Benning?
Yeah, did the whole enlisted as an 11 Bravo with a Ranger contract. So did the Fort Benning 1 station unit training thing, went to airborne school, and then Ranger indoctrination RIP at the time. I think it's called RASP now. Did 3 years at 2nd Ranger Battalion at Fort Lewis, and then went to Special Forces selection from there.
So you actually got stationed in Washington at Fort Lewis with 2nd Rangers?
I did, yeah. I mean, as you know, like there's not the Army's funny because I don't think the Army heavily recruits out of like the West Coast or the Pacific Northwest that much. So when I was in Ranger indoctrination at Fort Benning, Georgia, at the end of it, when they said, "Hey, you graduated, you made it, you're going to go to Ranger Regiment," there's 3 battalions. You can stay here at Fort Benning, or you can go to the beach, 1st Ranger Battalion, or you can go to some place called Fort Lewis, Washington, where it rains all the time. And so I guess I just lucked out. And there was a bunch of kids in my class who were, I think there was 2 of us maybe that were from the West Coast. And so we got our number 1 draft pick while everybody else fought over going to the beach.
So you get stationed out at Fort Lewis, did you deploy with the Rangers?
So this is pre 9/11. So I did a lot of training. It's like, I think Ranger Battalion is the best place in the Army to grow up. So no, I was there from 98 to 01. I was actually in Special Forces selection when the attacks of 9/11 happened.
Oh man, what was that like?
It's pretty wild, man. I mean, I was an E4, and so I thought I knew everything. And so we were on like day 2 or 3 of selection. Mafia. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm the smartest guy in the world. I've been in Ranger Battalion for, and the cadre at Special Forces selection, they're very stoic. It's kind of like the hallmark of that program. They don't yell at you like they do in Ranger School and all that. And they came into the classroom one day after we did a ruck or a run, and they said, "Hey, America is under attack." And me kind of being a smart aleck, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, is there like a scenario for Special Forces selection? Like I thought we were just like, rucking and stuff. I didn't think there was some form of a mind game. And so they're explaining what's happening, and I'm like, I don't know, man. This seems like it's part of the game. And then they said, "Hey, if you're from Washington D.C. or you're from New York City, you need to go into one of these offices and call your family." And I was like, okay, this is probably real. And then they let us watch they brought in TVs and they let us watch the news, so we had an idea of what was happening. But the course kept rolling, and so every day or every couple of days when we were done, especially during land nav, the instructors would bring out newspapers, and they were just like, "You guys don't understand what's going on here. You're here trying to get through this, but America has changed, and you're gonna when you leave Camp McCall, you're gonna enter an America that's drastically changed forever."
Joe, I wasn't in the military at the time. I was a sophomore in college, and I think I woke up on 9/11 with a wicked hangover, never served anything in my life, didn't even know what the hell I wanted to do with my life. And I remember seeing that and didn't have any special military training. I remember being afraid. I also remember being really, really angry because having grown up in the 80s and 90s, I never thought that anything like that could happen to our country. And even as I lived through that as a sophomore in college, there was an overwhelming sense of foreboding in me, in that thinking to myself that America has changed forever. We're never going back.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny because I think maybe just from being in the Army in the late 90s, I was actually kind of skeptical that we were going to strike back and even do anything because I came in '98. I was in basic training when bin Laden and Al Qaeda hit the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and then I was in battalion when the Cole was attacked, and so I got out, and then especially it's kind of funny. I got back from selection. My battalion was forward deployed on training, and they read us that were on rear detachment. They read us the op order for Objective Rhino for the jump into Afghanistan. And so we loaded up war pallets, and we all thought we were going. And then within like a couple hours, we heard that 3rd Battalion, 3rd Ranger Battalion, was going to go do the deed. And then we saw it, like, I think a couple of days later, we saw it on the news. And so for me, coming out of the late 90s military, I was like, oh crap, man, that was it. I missed the Desert Storm, or I missed the Grenada or the Panama of my generation, which is funny to say now that we just got done with 20 years of as much war as you wanted. But that was my initial thought.
I know. I was just thinking that, like, boy, were you wrong about that?
Yeah.
Because I mean, not only did you come up during some of those crazy terrorist attacks, you lived and served in a post 9/11 America, and it seems like you were part of, and I know I was, the evolution of the Army from a force that was largely structured to facing, conventional threats. Soviet Russia, to a transition to brigade combat teams and counterinsurgency, and that's what we did in Afghanistan and Iraq for 20 freaking years. And so you're in SFAS, you graduate. What special forces team were you assigned to?
So I went to 5th Group. I was lucky enough to go to a dive team right away. So yeah, really lucked out there. I actually went to pre-scuba when I was still in Ranger Battalion, so I kind of had that little leg up coming out of the Q course to get me on a dive team right away. But, it's funny because I was the Special Forces course takes so long. I was a weapons guy. I didn't recycle, and I had a 6-month language. So it was a year and a half, and I missed the initial kickoff of the Iraq war. And so I was certain. I was like, dude, I missed the jump into Afghanistan. I missed the ground war. Like, I'm a loser. I'm never going to combat. But that was quickly over right when I got back to 5th Group. And these guys had just gotten done. These are the men on horseback in Afghanistan. They just did the ground invasion of Iraq. But right when I got there, my team sergeant was like, hey, this is not going to be done anytime soon. As a matter of fact, we're going back in a couple of months. And we're going to go after all these HVTs, but then we're also going to have to do probably some unconventional warfare, start standing up the new Iraqi military. So I as much as at the time I thought I had missed it, I got there at a perfect time.
What year did you end up going?
I got there in 2003 and then deployed right afterwards. So by the summer of 2003, I was over in Iraq.
So when you were in Iraq in those early days, was your mission largely kinetic? Were you largely going after high value targets?
Yeah, I had an amazing mix. So my team that I went to, we were a direct action team. That's because like the typical like special forces configuration, there's a company that specializes in direct action. Those guys got put on a reserve status for some reason. The CENTCOM commander, I don't know why, he wanted them to go sit, I think, somewhere in the Gulf. And so my team and another team got the last minute frago that, hey, you guys are kicking indoors until otherwise notified, which was a good deal for me coming out of Ranger Battalion because I was like, I could do that. So cool. So yeah, we initially got assigned to go after the famous deck of cards. And we did that for the first couple of months. As a matter of fact, when I was flying over to Iraq, the team that we were going to replace, they went after the UN bombers. So Zarqawi's debut, when he blew up the UN headquarters, I got there and literally the team that we're replacing, they lost 2 guys tragically, Bill Bennett and Kevin Moorhead, and they're washing the blood out of the trucks they're handing to us as they take off and head home.
What was that like?
It was wild. I mean, I was lucky because I had trained for combat for so long in Ranger Battalion, what felt like so long to me as a 23-year-old. But I felt like I was ready, but it was still pretty surreal. I mean, especially arriving and relieving a team that had just lost 2 very senior members in a very bloody gunfight. It was like, okay, this is real, and we're going back out there, and we're going to get our piece of this, and we better be on our A game, or they're going to get us.
I mean, did you get a sense that the enemy had evolved to your tactics, techniques, and procedures almost immediately as you were operating? Did you have to evolve those as the fight wore on?
Yeah, we certainly did. 03 and 04, I think especially the Iraqi insurgency, they really showed how adaptive they are. At first, I mean, there was the old Saddam holdouts, and there was some, initial Al Qaeda guys, and it wasn't very organized. But in very short order, they realized that, hey, we don't want to stand and fight the Americans. However, these guys are driving everywhere because Iraq, you can drive on the roads in Iraq. And so their IED game, I just remember watching that thing evolve. I mean, initially, some of the IEDs that we were facing, they were just not very well shaped. And so they would just kind of blow up and they wouldn't really hit anybody. We were lucky because we were using a lot of non-standard vehicles. So we would blend in with a lot of the Iraqi traffic. And unfortunately, the conventional guys in the massive convoys, they seemed to be the testing bed for the Iraqi IED EFP machine. So watching them evolve in that, but then they also really dangerously adapted to the way that we did our raids. They knew that we were aggressive and we liked to go in and kick in doors and get after them. And it wasn't too long before they were luring us into houses and then blowing up the house on us.
So did that ever happen to you?
That luckily never happened to me. We avoided it a couple times because of really spot on intelligence, because we knew what to look for. But yeah, I lost friends that way, just going out. I mean, they were doing what we were trained to do, which is go be aggressive, eliminate, dominate, control, get in there, but the insurgents really adapted to that. So I lost two really good friends, essentially in, house-born IEDs, we'd call them, or a suicide bomber, just deliberately waiting to bait an assault force into a room to blow himself up.
I mean, so I'm sitting here thinking, having had similar experiences in my life, these are the experiences that shaped you as essentially a young American. Lived through the Iraq War. When did you meet Shannon?
We didn't meet until much later. So we met initially for 10 minutes in 2007 at the embassy in Baghdad, and then I didn't see her again until 2013. So
was she deploying at the same time, like in 2003, around the same time that you were, and you were just deploying to the same areas of operation, but just never crossed paths?
She joined the military in 2003. I'm like 3 or 4 years older than she was. So she joined in 2003. She was an Arabic linguist, so it took her a while to get through training and learn the Arabic language. Her first deployment, I think, was about 2007. I met her on her first deployment. Real briefly, I sat in on a briefing she was giving on, where some bad guys were located. But yeah, we were in the same areas. We were in Baghdad a lot at the same times together. We knew a lot of the same people throughout the years.
That is crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Do you feel like now, looking back, I mean, hindsight's always 20/20. Do you feel like your time in Iraq, or deployed all around the world, really, do you feel like it was worth it?
I mean, for me personally, like I wouldn't have done anything different as a young man. Like, our country was going to send somebody off to war. I'm sure you probably feel the same way. Like, if someone's going, like, we're going, However, looking back, like, objectively, when you step out and you say, was this worth it for America to spend, I think $8 trillion, and for us to lose, probably about 8,000 lives, and then just to have catastrophic results throughout the region, was it worth it? Absolutely not. I mean, this is why I'm so adamant that we have responsible, sober leadership in Washington, D.C., especially when it comes to how our nation uses force, and like, are we going to go to war? What is the actual goal? I don't know how you feel, but when I was over there, I had, even as a very young guy, I remember on my first deployment, we did the kinetic direct action thing for a while, and then we got tasked with standing up the Iraqi military. And so we took a bunch of the anti-Saddam militias, and we essentially demobilized them and formed them into one force. The Kurds were kind of the backbone of that. But I remember demobilizing some of the Shia militias, and these guys had blatant ties to Iran. And I was like, man, this doesn't seem like the greatest idea. And then we heard that Paul Bremer put out CPA Order 1, and he fired all the Sunnis, basically. He said if you had anything to do with the Ba'ath Party, you're fired, you can never work again. And I remember, like, my team talking about this, and my captain at the time, who was the most senior guy, he sent up a report that was like, we think this is a terrible idea. Just common sense wise, if you fired all of us back home, that's kind of a dangerous thing to do. But at the time in the back of my head, I was like, I bet there's some generals or there's some like CIA guys that have like a plan that just doesn't make sense to 23-year-old Sergeant Kent down here. So I'm just going to do my thing. And the more I tried to do that as the years went on, I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, we need sober leadership in Washington, D.C. I need someone to come explain to me what the actual goal is here.
And that's the thing that drives me crazy about the wars. And by the way, I agree with you. I look back at my time in Afghanistan. I mean, I wasn't a special forces guy. I didn't have multiple deployments, just one really, really long, horrible deployment. And that was enough for me. And the crazy thing about it, Joe, is I intended to go in and make it a career. And my path was I wanted to be a young light infantry lieutenant. I wanted to go to special forces assessment and selection, be a special forces guy, do all that stuff. I a year and a half, 16 months of combat. I was like, yeah, well, my 9 lives are up. I got to find something else to do. And the reality was, Joe, is I felt like I came back from Afghanistan. It was just, one direct fire after the next. It was emotionally, physically exhausting. And I remember talking to my commander about it and just said, I just can't do it. I don't think that I have what it takes anymore to lead. I had gotten back home. I had had a taste of what being home meant, and I just didn't think I could ever go back. And so that's why guys like you never cease to amaze me, because you did go back, and you went back multiple times. And the fact of the matter is that a very small percentage of Americans, like 0.4%, less than half of 1%, have served this country during the longest period of war in our nation's history.
Yep.
And that's half of 1% bore a very, very heavy burden and, sacrificed for this country in ways of which most Americans can never fully and truly understand. And looking back on the war and the fight, am I proud of my service? Absolutely. I volunteered to do it. I would do it again in a heartbeat. I am not a victim of my service in any way. I loved it. And we did lots of great things in Afghanistan. Taught little girls how to read, lots of humanitarian assistance, built wells and schools, and killed lots of bad guys too. But how can we possibly say that our time in Afghanistan was well spent after 20 plus years after the withdrawal that we saw last year? To your point, there's got to be somebody that's way smarter than me, some general somewhere that's thinking about all this stuff. I'm just going to focus on kicking doors, but I know that there's somebody out there thinking about this stuff. But clearly, they weren't.
No, they weren't. That was, for me, I always kind of wondered I wondered why we fired all the Sunnis in Iraq, but I also thought it was weird that we kept building these bigger bases. I remember thinking in 03 and 04, because our team house was, fairly austere. We weren't like building it out constantly. We worried about security, but I looked at like all the mega FOBs, the forward operating bases, and the garrisons that we were building there. And I was like, that's really weird. Like, what's going on here? I thought we were just going to get in, take out Saddam, give the Iraqis their freedom, and kind of get out of here. Like, and the same thing in Afghanistan. Like, what are we doing here? And after a while, I was like, oh, wait a sec. The only place where there's any kind of plan is to stay and to always apply more and more and more and more and more. And that, to me, after a while, that seemed to be the only consistent theme. The consistent theme was continue to pour more resources into these places. Don't worry about what what America is getting back in return. And I just found that absolutely disgraceful. And, we saw it all come imploding the way that we left Afghanistan. We kind of got off easy. We got a little bit lucky in Iraq, I think, as far as politically, because the surge. I could go on about the surge for quite a while, but the Iraqis had kind of in their civil war had really kind of worn each other out. But the Shias with Iran, they had gained such an advantage that they let us just sort of leave without a bloody nose in 2011. Now we all watched it implode a couple years later, and we had to come riding back in to save this government that didn't really even exist because they all surrendered their weapons to ISIS. We had to come back, and we're still over there. And then we just watched Afghanistan implode, and it's like we're still trusting the exact same cadre of people in Washington, D.C. to regulate foreign policy. And now they're telling us that, hey, we need to go provoke Russia in Ukraine. And like, it's kind of like, when does the madness actually end?
Oh, I mean, look, so so you're absolutely right. Let me talk about the surge for a second here.
Yeah.
So just to give you a perspective of what was happening for me, like I was in Afghanistan in 2006 to 2000s. We were supposed to go home in January 2007.
Yeah.
The surge happened. We actually were replaced. I had many of my soldiers in various stages of redeployment. So I ended up being the last guy with my platoon sergeant on the base in Afghanistan for the RIP, the relief in place of the 82nd Airborne, who were coming in to replace us in Regional Command East and Burmel, Afghanistan, at FOB Burmel. And 2 days before we were supposed to come home, we got extended out of nowhere. And again, my men had already deployed home. They had already linked up with their spouses, their children, reunited with families. And we got, hey, 4 months or until mission complete. And of course, the private mafia, they see the until mission complete and they're like, oh God, we're going to be here forever. They're going to leave us here for a year. And I have to admit, as a young first lieutenant who really didn't know a whole hell of a lot about the military, I started thinking like, well, the until mission complete thing is kind of scary. And come to find out later, so we did have to stay for 4 months, and we had to go through a whole nother spring offensive, and ended up being there for 16 months in RC East Afghanistan. But I say that to say, like, there was simply no one to replace us because they had sent all of our replacements to Iraq in support of the surge. And I mean, literally, we did not have the troops to replace us in Afghanistan. So to your point, no one's thinking about this stuff, man. And like, you look at what's happening. We still have Americans on the ground in Afghanistan right now that are probably trapped, can't get out. Yet the war, these warmongers in Washington, these politicians who think about sending America's sons and daughters into the fight first without thinking of, the consequences of what that will look like, what the mission is, what the end state is, what does victory look like, how is victory defined, when do we leave, and what does that look like for America, or even just the overall question, Joe, of is this in America's best interest? Does this actually protect us? And you talked about Ukraine. This is what obsesses, like, here we are already ready to transition to another fight, another war. Only this time, it's in many ways, it's vastly different than Iraq and Afghanistan, but similar in a lot of ways too. But you add to the fact that Russia is a nuclear power. The Bidens have this weird, strange relationship with Ukraine. It frankly feels like a money laundering operation, and we're just coming off 20 years of war, and it feels like to me, Joe, that we're just making the same mistakes, rushing headlong into the fight without actually thinking it through. And so, Joe, this is why it's so important for guys like you to run. It's why it's so important for guys who've seen the horror of war up close and personal and sacrificed to get in office and help make these decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially with Congress. I mean, I think over the global war on terror, Congress did a very terrible job of providing any kind of oversight or really even following the Constitution. Yeah, there was the initial authorization use of military forces at the very beginning, but then we just let the war on terror expand to include, just expanding back here at home with the Patriot Act. But just we would continue to let the president choose a new war and use the same old tired authorization use of military force and not make the president come to the table and say, hey guys, this is why we need to go to Libya. This is why we need to go to Syria. Do you agree? How do your constituents feel about it? Congress, the founders were geniuses. The founders didn't want the executive branch to have control over war. They wanted the representatives to go back and say, hey, are you guys in for this? Are you going to send your sons and daughters? Are you going to send your taxpayer dollars over to country X to fight a war? And we're not doing that. We're not learning from the last 20 years. And like you said, we got out of Afghanistan in a disastrous way in August of 21. And within a month or two, we were being told that, hey, like things are getting bad over in Ukraine. Like we really need to pay attention to that. And then sure enough, Russia tragically invades Ukraine, and the exact same tired lines to justify war escalation are being used. Like this is an existential threat to the whole world. If you're not with the war party, then you're with Putin. It's the exact same thing they were saying in the lead up to the Iraq war. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. It's like we got to have some pattern recognition and say, hey, the last time Washington, D.C. came to us and just told us to blindly sign off on the checks, what happened? I mean, it's a very fair question for people to ask. And this is where I think we need representatives. And to include, I know I have some friends that are Republicans that say, hey, we do need to be all in, standing up to Putin. That's fine. Let's have that debate on the floor of Congress. Let's go back and have to stand in town halls before our people and say, like, how do you guys feel about this right now with the state of our country, with us going over there and potentially, like you said, I mean, yeah, it's a war, it's a fight. We're kind of doing it through proxies. But if things go wrong, it's not going to be just an Afghan collapse. It's not going to be ISIS rolling across the berm and taking back, over Iraq. This isn't the Middle East. This is Europe. This is a nuclear power. We haven't dealt with this since the Cold War. It's very dangerous.
Yeah, and you talk about, first of all, that debate on the House floor about the conflict and how whether or not America should fight it in the first place and what the mission is and all of that. The American people deserve that dialogue. And I don't care what political party you're in, Republican, Democrat, Independent, other, I don't care. If we're going to send America's sons and daughters to go fight, bleed, and die in a fight, and then, by the way, come home and struggle, because as you and I both know, the war doesn't end when you're over there and when you come home. There are longstanding consequences to sending our citizens to fight, and the American people deserve that debate. And you understand, because you've seen the horrors of war personally. And Joe, you lost your spouse, Shannon, who also volunteered to serve this country after 9/11, loved this country. You celebrate her legacy all the time, but you lost her as part of this fight. And I know for me, when I came back from Afghanistan, that I was wounded, and so I began the medical retirement process, but they made me the rear detachment commander of 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, and it was by far 100 times worse than combat, because I had to take care of wounded guys coming home. I had to train up young soldiers to go over there, and I also had to be that knock on the door when families lost loved ones, and it was the worst. It was an extraordinarily tough job. But Joe, you lived through that too. You've seen both sides of this fight. Help the people that are watching this understand, what that knock on the door was like for you.
Yeah, I kind of had a unconventional knock on the door. I was actually deployed at the same time. I wasn't. Shannon was deployed to Syria. I was on a shorter trip over to Africa. I had retired from the military. I was in the CIA at the time. But I actually had been out, doing some stuff that day. I came back, and a good friend of mine who I was in special forces with, and he had made the transition over to the CIA as well. He said, "Hey, I need to talk to you." And he kind of like had everybody leave the room. And so I didn't know what it was about. And he said, "Hey, I'm just going to tell you exactly what I know right now." And there was a suicide bomber in Manbij, Syria, and there's 2 U.S. females that are killed in action. And so we don't know their names yet. And I was like, okay, well, I knew Shannon was in Manbij, and there's not a lot of women in this occupation. So I spent the next couple hours just trying to get a hold of her. But by the time I realized that she wasn't answering, we had confirmation that she was, killed in action. So then unfortunately I had to make some really hard phone calls. I wanted to tell her parents before the Navy drove somebody out to knock on their door as well. So I called Shannon's mom to let her know what happened and what was about to happen, that Shannon had been killed and that someone was going to come and knock on her door and formally tell her. And then from there, it was I got on an airplane the next morning and flew home so that I could be at Dover in time to receive her remains.
Joe, what was that like to have that conversation with her parents?
Hard. I mean, I was still processing what happened. I think just the training and the conditioning of having to deal with casualties for at that point, almost 20 years, kind of took over. And so I really didn't process a lot of it until days later. But it was very difficult. I remember sitting there like looking at my phone. I'm like, okay, I can call her and I can tell her over the phone, which is probably one of the worst ways she can find out about this. Or she can get blindsided by, they live kind of out in rural New York State. I'm like, or whatever Navy guy gets tasked to drive from, I don't know, New York City, from Albany out there to go knock on her door is going to be, a stranger is going to have to tell her. And so for me, I was like, it's best that I give her a call and let her know personally. But yeah, it was probably the hardest phone call I'll ever have to make.
I can't imagine, Joe. and I'm sorry that you even had to make it. How'd your I mean, of course, how have your children been able to process this?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, they were 1 and 3 when they're 5 and 7 now. They were 1 and 3 when she was killed. So, I came home and I actually talked to some child psychologists, some grief specialists, just to get advice because I didn't. The only training I had was how to tell, a soldier or a spouse, that their loved one had been killed. I had no idea how to deliver that news really to my kids, and they gave me some pretty good advice about just, hey, kids. There's not a lot left for innuendo of children, so you actually have to be pretty blunt with them. And so I just had to tell them that their mom was killed and she's not coming home, which they didn't. Obviously, they were 1 and 3. The 1-year-old especially didn't. He couldn't fully process any of that. The 3-year-old, he didn't quite understand that either. So we kind of go through that. Sort of continuously that she's still with us. She's in heaven. She loves us. She can see us. You're going to see her again. But she's not here. And so I think that now that they're getting older, they understand the permanence of death in a way that I think most adults don't fully understand until they're much older.
Joe, you've just been through so much, serving this country and losing your spouse, in support of this great country and in the service of this great country, and lost friends, obviously, over 20 years of war. So why serve again? Why run for Congress?
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, I thought once I was out of the military and once I was out of the CIA after Shannon was killed, I was going to need to take a really, really long pause and just really focus on the kids. So we were living on the East Coast in the DC area. I moved back here to the Pacific Northwest, and I kind of thought that'd be it. I had an opportunity to meet President Trump at Dover, and I was a pretty early supporter of President Trump because of his foreign policy stances. He won me over when he went after the Republican establishment. Because after Bush and Obama, I was like, man, the uniparty is a very real thing, and it doesn't really matter if we get a Republican or a Democrat. And
100% with you.
Yeah, and I didn't know anything about Trump other than like he was on a TV show or whatever. And so I didn't take him very seriously until the debates. And when he went after Jeb Bush and he went after the Iraq War, I was like, I'm voting for this guy. He's got me 100%. And then deploying with him as commander in chief. And so, for folks who don't know, Shannon was killed a month after Trump attempted to get our troops out of Syria the first time. So we met our mission objective. The stated objective of our troops being in Syria was to eliminate the Islamic Caliphate. We took out the last scrap of ground that ISIS controlled in December of 2018. And that's when Trump famously, he tweeted it, but he also put out orders saying, we're getting our troops out of Syria, because he ran on this. He was like, hey, I'm going to crush ISIS, but then we're not staying. We're getting out of the Middle East. And that's when Secretary of Defense Mattis, Brett McGurk at the State Department did their public resignations. And I was talking with Shannon this entire time. They had orders to be out of Syria by Christmas Eve of 18. They were going to fly to Erbil, Iraq, a much safer location, and kind of start to retrograde from there. However, I was very skeptical. I was like, the machinery, the apparatus, they're going to do everything they can to have us stay in Syria and expand the war. And sure enough, that date came and went. And then a month later, they were in Syria out there in harm. Look, that part of Syria is probably always going to be dangerous. And so they were out there, I think, doing a mission they didn't need to be doing. They were doing their duty as soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And they were killed doing it. And so had the unelected bureaucrats actually listened to President Trump, my wife and the 3 other Americans that she was killed with. She was killed with 3 other Americans that day. John Farmer, a Green Beret, father of 4. Scott Wirtz, a former Navy SEAL. Gadir Taha, a Syrian American. Like that's 4 lives that were absolutely unnecessarily lost had Trump's orders been followed. And so when I got the opportunity to meet Trump at Dover, I just said, hey, look, you, Mr. President, I appreciate you being here. You don't know me, but I've been fighting these wars for 20 years. You're getting it right, but you're being undermined at the mid to senior levels in ways that I've never seen before. And I just want you to know that your gut instincts are right. And we appreciate what you're doing, but don't trust the people around you. And that was kind of the beginning of...
What did President Trump say to you?
He's you've met with President Trump, and he
yeah.
kind of he looked at me and he was like, "What do you do again?" And I told him, I was like, "Hey, I work over at the CIA. I'm working at the CIA, but I'm resigning. I was a Green Beret for 20 plus years." And he just kind of nodded his head. I mean, he was very very compassionate. He had done research on Shannon. He knew who she was. And then his folks reached back out to me. Trump's national security team reached out to me about 2 weeks later, and they said, "Hey, we don't know exactly what you said to the boss, but he wants to hear more. Will you come back out and talk with us?" And I said, "Yeah, I mean, if you guys want to hear what I have to say, sure, absolutely." And so I kind of started a relationship with the Trump administration, got to speak quite a bit with Jared Kushner about foreign policy. And so I was going to go back and work in a second Trump admin, worked a little bit on the Trump campaign. So my view at the time was like, hey, if these guys think I can be value added and they're trying to do things differently, I'm all in. I'll do whatever I can. And then obviously the 2020 election went the way that it did. And then the district that I was living in, we had the whole Antifa thing, the rioting going on. It just seemed like the world was imploding, COVID lockdowns. And so I was like, I'm going to step forward and try and provide some leadership right now. Because for me, it's like the stakes are too high. My family, my kids have already lost so much that if we lose the country in this process, I'm not going to be able to look my kids in the eye and say like, hey, America used to be pretty great, but then we all kind of got tired. And we stopped fighting for it, and we let these people take over. So we're not going down without a fight, and I think the country is 100% still. We're the last salvation for humanity, and so we have to continue this fight. That's the way I look at it.
There's nowhere else to go.
Nowhere else to go. Yeah.
Like freedom's last stand has to happen here. And what I admired about President Trump is his ability to resist Washington groupthink. Yeah. And it amazes me when you're in that town how people on either side of the aisle, the uniparty is really a thing. And you hear people talk about the deep state and whatever, but there are unelected bureaucrats that, especially during President Trump's administration, who worked at every step of the way to undermine his agenda, and that's why this country needs people like you, Joe. And and when you stood back up to run again, obviously 2022 was a tough cycle. I know what it's like to lose a congressional campaign, lose a congressional campaign with air quotes, because the reality is our elections in this country are a disaster. And I don't care how much media pressure is on me or I've received for talking about stuff like this. But the reality is when you have mail-in ballots with no date, no signature verification, can be dropped off in a Dropbox, you don't know the person who's actually casting that vote is that person. You just don't know. That's why the Carter administration said, hey, wait a second, mail-in ballots aren't secure. That's why the New York Times in 2012 said, hey, mail-in ballots and probably aren't the best thing in the world for election integrity or security, and that's why almost all of Europe banned mail-in ballots. So, but that notwithstanding, Joe, the fact that you're back in the fight is inspirational to me, and I know it's inspirational to a lot of people, Joe. And this country, I know when people watch this, they've got to give money to your campaign. They've got where can people find you? Where can people give money to support your race?
Yeah, Joe Kent for Congress, forcongress.com is the place to do that. That's where you can take donations. There's links to all my social media on there. So Joe Kent for Congress.com.
And let me explain something. To the people that are watching, not to you, Joe, because you know this, you've already run a campaign, but fundraising is critically important. And I think having run 2 campaigns myself, there are a lot of people on our side of the aisle that don't understand how it works. And if you're a federal candidate and you're running for Congress, you can take max contributions. I think it's $2,900 for the primary and the general, double that for a married couple. Right. But you look at how much money some of these races cost, like in the state of Pennsylvania, for example, you saw how many tens of millions of dollars were spent on a statewide race. And for a run in Congress, you need several $1 million to run a successful campaign, especially in a battleground district like yours, Joe. So there are only so many people who can swing a $2,900 campaign contribution for the primary and the general. So of course, any and every candidate needs as many of those as humanly possible. But the lifeblood of campaigns are small dollar donors, and not just small dollar donors, but the people who say, I'm going to give Joe Kent $5 a month for the next 12 months. Now you get, 500,000 people from all across the country doing that. Now you're talking. And that's how the Democrats fundraise, and that's how Republicans need to start thinking about fundraising, is giving money directly to candidates like you. Obviously giving money to the party is important because you want them to be able to defend candidates and incumbents and all that stuff, but money is always best spent when it goes directly to the candidate who, in your case, is running for Congress in Washington 3, Washington's 3rd Congressional District, where you can spend that money. You know your constituents, you know what's important, you can message to them and make the case to them, but in order to do that, you need fundraising dollars. And I always liken it to the fundraising dollars are like bullets in your gun in combat. You run out of ammo when you're surrounded by the enemy and getting attacked, you can't fight back, you die. Well, if you run out of fundraising dollars here in this country when you're running a campaign, you're going to get attacked relentlessly because the left never wants for fundraising dollars, and they'll just pound you on TV and make up lies about you. Yep. And people like you, Joe, won't be able to respond.
Yeah, I mean, with the exception of like podcasts like yours, Tucker Carlson, and a few others, we have to basically pay for all of our media, whereas the Democrats have the New York Times, they have the corporate media. Their fundraising mechanisms are very, very efficient. We raised $3 million last cycle, and I'm grateful for all my max donors. However, we raised the vast majority of that off of, like you said, the small dollar donors. Raised $3 million. Our average contribution averaged out, even with the max donors, to be about $52, which is pretty amazing when you think of it. And we went from 0 to 3 million to actually be able to take out a 12-year incumbent.
That's the way that you have to do it, Joe. And you're an inspirational candidate. And I know that, President Trump supports you and loves you. And really, to me, you're once in a generation type of candidate who you've seen combat. You know what that's like. You've lost loved ones. You've lost friends. This country needs people like you in Congress. And so, man, I appreciate you joining me. I don't want to keep you for too long. I could talk to you for hours, man, but you are welcome to come back on this show anytime. And you don't need my support, but I'm going to do everything that I can to help you because we need guys like you to win.
No, I really appreciate it, man. Getting the endorsement from my fellow warfighters, I really appreciate it. And I got to say something else, man. You're very humble about your service, as most regular Army guys are. However, when I talk about all the tours I did, my tours were somewhere between 6 months. My longest one was about 8 months. You guys that say like, oh, I just did one tour that were over there for 16 months, you guys are always way too humble about that. So it's always good to caveat what tours really are. So you did more than your fair share, and I'd love to see you in office somewhere. But I appreciate you having me on, man. I really do.
Well, thanks, brother. You know what I'm going to do? I might just start mailing ballots to Afghanistan. I said, sir, I was over there for so long that I probably legally do that, And but that's right. Afghanistan doesn't allow mail-in ballots because they're not secure. But anyway, Joe, thank you for joining, man. You're welcome back anytime. God bless you, and God bless your campaign and your family and your kids, and God bless this great country that we get to call home.
Thanks, brother. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Joe.
Take care.